The new World Health Organization pandemic treaty is coming up, and we finally have some MPs in Parliament speaking out against it. Yes, we've been keeping you guys posted on this new treaty that is going around the world, and they're getting all the member states of WHO getting together and creating a new consensus, and everyone's going to be happy. But what does this actually mean? So we already had 2020 and 2021, the years of lockdown measures. It wasn't just a blanket policy lockdown measures that were a problem. It was what happened after the first lockdown that became more problematic. You had the rule of six, the 10 p.m. curfew, Scotch eggs, so many idiotic measures. We had localized, regionalized lockdowns. You had a traffic light scheme and everything else. And each country had a bit of a meltdown, and then they had overreaction to what was happening just because Italy went down. Everybody had to follow it because everything came from one main consensus. The forums inside the World Health Organization saying, well, we recommend you to do this. And politicians said, well, okay, well, we'll do it because everyone else is doing it. Now we have a situation where this new pandemic treaty could be a bit of a slippery slope in regards to moving away from just recommendations to making things mandatory. Policy decision could come from people like Tedros and his colleagues, even though we didn't actually elect any of them. Now, the WHO new treaty means that lockdowns to be imposed on the UK and, of course, other countries who are member states of this international body. Now, who's going to be speaking out against it? But that's what we're going to talk about in this video. And also, I'm going to ask, is it going to be enough in regards to any sort of rebellion in regards to this issue and in defense of democracy and transparency? Now, member states would have to follow instructions by the agency when responding to pandemics, which could see the introduction of, the so-called health passports and border closures and quarantine measures under a draft update to its regulations. So the WHO could act as a world government when it comes to public health measures. It's something that they were denying until 6 months ago, well, a year ago maybe. They were saying in 2020 that we are just the health experts. Well, we are here to just trying to save you from yourself. We are just mere civil servants, basically, bureaucrats. But now they want to be the policymakers and decision makers. And this is going to be a quite big issue in certain countries. Now, which country could actually speak out first? That is going to be quite interesting because there are some people in the Netherlands right now rising up against it. There are some people in Scandinavian countries doing it, but are we actually going to get anything proper in the UK or in America? Now, in America, you might say, could be hopeful if either someone like Trump or DeSantis become president, maybe they could reverse this treaty. But can they? Or the establishment and the state are still going to go ahead regardless of who's in charge? That's the main question. Considering we already talked about this earlier today, how at the same time, Tedros and many others from WHO are coming out to say, we have to prepare for a new scary disease, something that's even scarier than the 2020 virus and everything else that happened. So they are already feeding us all these new data saying, well, I think in the name of public health and global health, we must promote this new treaty and do not question the treaty. Just pass it, just like how every European Union regulation directive was passed and say, well, it's coming anyway. We're just doing it to make things more efficient and streamlined. And now we've got over 4,000 EU laws that we're not removing because our government is incompetent and, well, just not really into listening to the British public. So the new pandemic treaty proposals mean that Britain would be required to spend 5% of its health budget on preparing for another outbreak. So this is not 5% of GDP because we've got a huge percentage of GDP spent on health, but 5% of that is going to go towards WHO and this new treaty. Now, who's going to be holding them to account if the money is not spent properly? Who's going to be holding them to account if the money is going to be focused on areas that doesn't really relate to us? Because each country is different. When it comes to geography, when it comes to demographics, when it comes to everything, the requirements of each nation and culture is different. You cannot have a blanket policy around the world, again, in the name of one world governance. Doesn't work that way. What happened in Italy is very different to what happened in Singapore. And what happened in Sweden is different to what happened in Canada. You can't treat everybody the same way. But it's the same mentality that created the European project, the EU, is now happening on a global level. Now, there are some Tory MPs who are now making a bit of a push, but it's all thanks to one person, actually, individuals like Andrew Bridgeman, who is now a Reclaim Party MP, who started to talk about this first. But we now have Christopher Chope, for example, saying, my principal concern is that there is a move afoot within the WHO to transform it from being an advisory body to one which is able to compel members to behave in a particular way, and that will completely change the character of the organization. Yeah, we've been saying this for such a long time. Now we got MPs finally waking up. So, well, better now, late than never, I guess. Andrew Bridgeman was one of the first few who started talking about this, and he's actually calling for a referendum on the WHO treaty. Now, he spoke in this debate, but a lot of his colleagues in the chamber, in the House of Commons, walked out the moment he stood up to speak about this. Then he had a debate in Westminster Hall. Members who were at that event and debate, they weren't really paying attention. Most of them were on their phones, tweeting nonsense and everything else. But all these the moves that we are making, they are working slowly. So we now have 6 Tory MPs led by Esther McVey, who've written to Mitchell to call for a House of Commons vote on the draft treaty. Now, Esther McVey said, there is rightly growing concern about the WHO's pandemic treaty and international health regulations. The plans represent a significant shift for the organization from a member-led advisory body to a health authority with powers of compulsion. This is particularly worrying when you consider the WHO's poor track record on providing consistent, clear, and scientifically sound advice for managing international disease outbreaks. Well, that's also a very good point that Esther McVey makes, because they don't really have a good track record. It's the same as, for example, the IMF deciding to become the main central bank for the whole world, saying, well, you guys can't even predict what's going to happen with the GDP, but you claim to be the futuristic advisors. You're planning something that hasn't happened yet based on scenarios that didn't actually happen. You're creating your own scenarios in your head, and you're feeding it to the propaganda machine, which is the mainstream media. And every time we speak out, we have to shut up about it. But we're not allowed to ask questions, apparently. This is where we are, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to give up the fight. We will continue to hold them to account on this channel, because that's one thing we had left in our so-called democratic system. We could ask questions. So let's ask some questions. Let me know what you think. I'm Mahyar, Tousi, and we are the media.